You already know the feeling. You just don't have a name for it yet. You've probably seen this person somewhere. Maybe a friend, a colleague, someone sitting across from you who seemed, from every external angle, to be choosing not to try. The work sat undone, the room stayed the way it was. The thing they'd been meaning to do for weeks remained unstarted, not for lack of intelligence, not for lack of desire, but for reasons nobody in the room could name, including them. Or maybe that person is you. There is a version of your day that exists in your head. The emails answered, the room cleaned, the thing you've been putting off finally done. You can see it. You can describe it in detail. You know exactly what it would take to make it real. And then you sit down to begin, and something happens that you don't quite have language for. Not tiredness exactly, not distraction exactly, more like a signal that never quite reaches the muscle. The thought forms, the intention forms, and then there's a gap, vast and strange and completely invisible to anyone watching you from the outside, between the intention and the action. So you wait. You open the same tab 3 times. You tell yourself you'll start after this next thing, after you feel a little more ready, after the weight in your chest settles into something manageable. It doesn't. The day moves around you while you stay still. And from the outside, you know exactly what it looks like. From the outside, it looks like you're not trying, like you don't care, like you are, in the simplest and most damning reading of the word, lazy. What it actually looks like underneath, that's a different story, and it has a name that isn't that. The word lazy has probably followed you for a while. Maybe someone said it out loud, a parent who couldn't understand why you needed to be asked 4 times, a teacher who noted your potential alongside your inconsistency, a boss who watched you miss a deadline and drew a conclusion about your work ethic. Or maybe no one said it directly, and that's almost worse, because the absence of a word doesn't mean the absence of a verdict. You heard it in the sighs, you felt it in the comparisons, you absorbed it in the silence after you said, "I don't know why I can't just do it," and nobody had an answer. And eventually, you stopped waiting for someone else to say it. You started saying it to yourself. What looks like laziness from the outside has a name, and that name is not laziness. It's not a character flaw that was always going to catch up with you. It's not a moral failing you've been too comfortable to address. The gap you keep falling into, the one between knowing and doing, between intending and beginning, is not evidence of who you are. It's evidence of what's happening inside a specific system, and that system has been running on a different frequency than you were ever told was normal. Here is what is actually happening. Here's where the story actually starts. Not in your adult life, though that's where most of it has played out. It starts earlier, in the classrooms where you were bright enough that everyone assumed doing was simple, and the gap between your ability and your output became the most confusing thing in the room. In the households where effort was the currency of worthiness, where trying hard was the proof of goodness and not trying hard was its own kind of verdict. You didn't learn this consciously. Nobody sat you down and explained the equation. You absorbed it the way children absorb most things, through repetition, through reaction, through the small adjustments you made to explain yourself to people who needed a simpler explanation than the truth. And somewhere in that absorption, your nervous system drew a quiet conclusion. Not that the environment was difficult, not that the expectations were misaligned, that the gap between you and doing was evidence of something wrong with you. And you carried that conclusion forward into every deadline, every task left undone, every day that moved without you in it. And the truth is this: your brain's motivational system was not built the way you were told it was. Most people understand motivation as a function of willpower. You want something, you decide to do it, you do it. Simple, clean, moral. But that model describes motivation the way a map describes terrain. accurate enough in the overview, catastrophically wrong in the details. Because motivation isn't primarily about wanting, it's about dopamine. Specifically about what researchers call reward prediction error, the gap between what your brain expects to happen and what actually does. When that gap is positive, when an outcome is better than predicted, dopamine is released, and your brain registers the behavior as worth repeating. When that signal doesn't fire the way it should, the behavior doesn't get encoded as rewarding, no matter how much you consciously want to do it. And without that encoding, the body doesn't move. In a brain affected by depression or ADHD, and often both since the two co-occur far more than most people realize, this system misfires in specific ways. The reward signal is either delayed, blunted, or simply absent for anything that isn't immediately stimulating. Think of it less like a broken engine and more like an engine that requires a different grade of fuel. Other people can run on the low-grade stuff, the vague, future-oriented rewards of, "this will be good for me eventually." Your brain, under depression or ADHD, may only fire reliably on high-octane, urgency, novelty, emotional stakes, genuine fascination. Anything outside those categories doesn't generate the activation signal, and without the activation signal, the body stays still. And here's where it gets interesting, because depression and ADHD look almost identical from the outside, and catastrophically different from the inside. Depression's version of this is anhedonia. The technical term sounds clinical, almost detached, but the lived experience is anything but. It's the quiet erosion of the ability to want things. Not sadness necessarily, not tears, more like the dimming of a pilot light you didn't notice you relied on until it was gone. You used to care about things, you remember caring, but the caring has gone somewhere you can't reach, and everything that used to feel like a reason to begin now feels approximate and remote. The gap between you and the task isn't a gap in effort, it's that the reward circuitry has been suppressed through disrupted serotonin signaling and a blunted norepinephrine response that normally drives arousal and focus. The signal that says, "this matters, begin," simply isn't generating. You are not refusing to try. You are waiting for a train that isn't running. ADHD is something else. In ADHD, the reward system isn't dimmed, it's differently calibrated. Researchers sometimes describe it as an interest-based nervous system, meaning activation comes from engagement rather than importance. You are not actually bad at starting things. You are bad at starting things that don't fire the right circuits. Put you in front of something that fascinates you, something urgent, novel, personally meaningful, emotionally alive, and the executive function that seemed broken materializes from nowhere. That's not inconsistency. That's the system working exactly as it's wired. The problem is that most of adult life is built around low stimulation, future-oriented tasks, and your brain holds out for something that actually matters to it. Here's the part most people never ask. What does it feel like when both are happening at once? Because they can be, and often are. Depression blunts the reward signal. ADHD requires a specific kind of signal to activate at all. Together, the result is a nervous system with almost no reliable entry points into action. Not because you are unwilling, but because the architecture that generates momentum has been compromised from two directions simultaneously. And on the outside, this looks indistinguishable from not caring, from choosing not to try, from being, in the simplest and most damning reading of the word, lazy. Now here's where the story complicates. The very thing that once helped you survive your early environment, that relentless internal audit of whether you were doing enough, the hypervigilance that arrived before anyone else's disappointment could, is the same thing that now keeps you frozen. You learn to scan for evidence of your own inadequacy before anyone else could find it. That internal critic was protective once. It got there first. It let you preempt the verdict by delivering it to yourself. And it worked, in the way that childhood adaptations work. Imperfectly, at great cost, and long past the point where it was needed. There's a deeper layer underneath this, because that critic didn't disappear. It became the background signal your nervous system runs on. And here is the neurological cost. Shame activates the threat detection system. The amygdala fires. Cortisol rises. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for executive function, for planning, for beginning, goes offline. The shame that was supposed to close the gap actually widens it. You berate the engine, flood the engine, and then wonder why the engine won't start. Think about that moment from before. The open tab, the task you couldn't begin, the day moving around you while you stayed still. That wasn't you choosing comfort over effort. That wasn't a failure of will. That wasn't the verdict you've been carrying. The shame had arrived before the task did, and a nervous system already in threat state does not initiate. It does not plan. It conserves. The question that has never served you is, why can't I just do it? That question has always been looking in the wrong direction. The question that actually opens something is, what system, specifically, isn't getting the signal it needs? Because systems can be worked with, patterns can be understood, and understanding, not effort, not willpower, not shame, is the only intervention that actually reaches what's happening here. But here's the most important part. This is not a story about a character flaw that was always going to surface. It's not a story about potential squandered through laziness. It's a story about a nervous system that learned a set of responses to an environment that demanded them, and that now carries those responses into a life that never explained why they were still firing. That's not failure. That's not even a moral question. It's a pattern. And patterns, unlike verdicts, have mechanisms. And mechanisms, unlike character flaws, can be named. What changes when you understand the mechanism is not immediate ease. This channel doesn't promise that. Understanding reward prediction error doesn't fix it. Naming executive dysfunction doesn't dissolve it. But what understanding can begin to do, and this is not a small thing, is remove shame from the starting point. Not permanently, not all at once, but enough to give the system a different place to begin from. And a different place to begin from is not nothing. You were told you weren't trying hard enough. You were told the gap between you and doing was a verdict on your character. You were told that the version of you who couldn't begin was the truest version of you. You were never meant to carry that verdict. You were never meant to see yourself through the eyes of everyone who didn't have a name for what was actually happening. You were never meant to cross the gap on willpower alone, as though the gap were something you chose. The gap between knowing and doing has a name, and once you have it,